Hello and welcome to ARRB's first webinar for 2020, Australians and their cars. And 2020 is a very special year for ARRB. It's our 60th anniversary. We have a long history of research in the roads and transport space, and a big part of what we've been doing since we started out in 1960 is to help educate. This webinar is a prime example. During this webinar, we'll provide a mix of nostalgia as we look at Australians and their car industry and our love affair with cars through the years. We'll give some important new knowledge about road safety and some interesting snippets on crash investigation, and we'll look into the future to what might hold for Australians and the cars we drive. So any further information, I'm happy to give that. My name is Rosie and I'm moderating the session. So you'll see my email details at the end. We'll plan to go for 60 minutes and there'll be time for questions, so please type them in. We love your input. Now, Lee Atkinson of Traveller magazine says there are two things everyone remembers, your first kiss and your first car. Australians have always had a love affair with the motor car. Australians own iconic Holden, Ford's mighty muscle cars. Our fascination with cars, trucks, motorcycles and even tractors seems to know no bounds. And he had a collection as a kid, and that collection has been his dream cars for his entire life. Now let's get started. So I'll introduce our presenters, and first on the rank is Paul Hillier, who has been our main designer for this webinar, and Paul is Principal Technology Leader, Transport Safety. Welcome, Paul, and I'm guessing that if Lee Atkinson is right, you would remember your first kiss and your first car.
Well, absolutely, Rosemary. Welcome. I'm actually in Sydney today, so we're around the country for the webinar, working on infrastructure safety within ARRB. But yeah, my first car is a 1973 Mini Clubman. You can see the colour of it there. NYL 363L. I can even remember the first registration number. And if you wanted to run it on 2-star petrol, you could. First kiss, well, I don't know where others are going to do that, but I reckon it's probably some playground kiss chase as a primary school, I would probably say. My dream car would certainly be a Ford GT Mustang, but it's common sense applies and family needs and all sorts of things. Currently driving a Hyundai Kona, and I'm very happy with that. I've had a number of Hyundais and very happy with the amount of safety features that I get on the car for the bang for the buck, as they say. So that's me. Looking forward to the webinar today.
Thank you, Paul. And next we have Tia Gaffney, Principal Professional Leader, Transport Safety, who is in the webinar studio with me today. Welcome, and do you remember your first kiss and first car?
First kiss. Lady never tells, I don't think. My first car, that's me and my first car. It is a beautiful 1996 Volkswagen Jetta. Looked up some fun facts about the Volkswagens. Apparently a lot of the Volkswagens are named after wind for some reason, and the Jetta apparently has something to do with the Atlantic jet stream. And I guess a few other cars that Volkswagen made have also been named after wind, so there you go. You'll notice in that photograph there's a Ford Bronco behind me. That's probably a bit more famous, made famous by O.J. Simpson and his high-speed chase in Los Angeles. So that's what's behind me. Are we going through all the cars? My dream car right there is a Corvette. The reason is my whole family is from Detroit, and that was just really the car to have if you were from Detroit, Michigan. And for my grandfather specifically, he told me if I study hard and become an engineer that I one day will be able to buy one of those. And so there you go. And then on the right, I don't actually have a car, so this is my pretend day car, and that's a Volvo XC90. And believe it or not, that vehicle has never been involved in a fatal or serious injury crash since it was made in 2003. So there has been zero, and that to me is the epitome of the Vision Zero.
That is unreal. Thank you. And Dickson Leow, Chief Technology Leader, Future Transport Systems. Welcome, and you're in the studio with me today. And your first kiss and first car, Dickson.
Thanks, Rosie. First kiss, probably let's not go into that. First car, I've had this 1979 TE Ford Cortina. It was a bit run down. It was orange as was being pictured there. I took the liberty of doing up the vehicle over a 2 years period while I was in my learners. Upon getting my license, after 2 weeks, I totaled the vehicle. It was a write-off. The council decides to put in a chicane, which I was not aware of. It was raining, and I didn't see the chicane. It ended up on a curbside and did some damage. It'd be a write-off. Daily driver, more into the now being a family man, into a SUV. As you can see there with the X1 and X3. I've got a project car that I've been doing, and my wife doesn't like it. It's trying to get sold. And yeah, over the last few years, it's been changing, like I say, being a family person now, switching from a sports car to an SUV.
Beautiful. And now next we have Alan Hay, National Strategic Analyst for ARRB and also patron of the Australian Confederation of Motor Clubs. Alan, welcome, and you're joining in off-site, and your first KISS, first car.
Thank you, Rosie. My first KISS would probably be my Blue Roan Cocker Spaniel, who didn't return the KISS, but sure appreciated it anyway. My first car was a Mark I Volkswagen Polo, 1980. Actually, it was two cars, I found out subsequently. They were welded together, so the police took an active interest in that one. Look, I've had quite a few cars, I think 37 at the last count. One of my faves was the Alfa Sud. God, it was a great car, going around the M25 in London with bits falling off of it everywhere. The car had sold, but it didn't have much else. Funnily enough, it was a 1.4 litre boxer engine, and the car itself was designed by a guy called Giugiaro, an Italian designer. So it's not really surprising that a lot of parts were falling off. Now, my aspirational car, I suppose, would be Bogward Isabella TS Coupe from, say, 1959. You may not really know that one, but I think we're starting to see a pattern amongst our presenters of the types of car they like. I'm going back in time. Made in Bremen, wonderful vehicle. In fact, Bogward sort of disappeared for quite some time. South America kept it going for a while, but they actually came out with a Bogward concept in 2017, believe it or not. But look, enough about me. Look, everybody from a motoring enthusiast perspective, most of them actually have daily drivers. Rosemary, you don't get off the hook. What are your cars? What were your favorite? That looks like a nice piece of Italian fashion in the top left there.
Thank you, Alan. Yes, I had a 1957 Fiat that cost $80 to buy and $120 to register. It had 4 on the column, and the passenger door flew open one day on a freeway, which was hard to get back because it opened outwards. I love my Datsun 120Y, and I now have a Yaris, and I would choose the car on the right because of its ANCAP rating as my dream car. So over to you, Paul. Now, can I ask you, thank you for gathering all these experts together, and could you outline the objectives of the webinar? Thank you, Paul.
My pleasure, of course. We're going to split it up into about 4 main topics, and the panel members are each going to lead a little bit of discussion. Going to be around about sort of 6 to 10 minutes on each topic, and there'll be ample opportunity in between those for people to ask some questions from the delegates. So as Rosie said, please type them in. We're going to start off with a little bit of historical did you know. Alan's going to talk to us about various vehicles that have shaped the culture, but also the mobility within Australia, and some information about the motoring fraternity and their importance. Dickson will be talking about some of the in-car in-vehicle safety systems and some of the autonomous vehicles, and Tia's very importantly going to be looking at how we're learning a lot more these days from incidents that are occurring, and some things you might not realise that are available to us as incident investigators, and that's going to help us down the track. We'll close up with a few thoughts on a few challenges, and if we get a time for a final question and answer, we'd love to be able to do that. So my duty is just a little bit on where it all began, 1896. The Thompson Motor Phaeton was exhibited in 1900, had pneumatic tyres made by the Dunlop Company, and not outstanding performances. You'll see there, 5 horsepower, 8.7 miles an hour. But the one thing that impressed me, over a journey length of around about 500 miles, so what's that, 750 kilometres. Things moved very fast after then, though, as people saw that. So from 1900 through to 1903, the first Australian Motoring Association, and then the AAA, what's that, some 21 years later. But as we know, there's been to a substantial car industry in Australia. A major global manufacturer played its part. And from the sort of baseline, I guess, of the first mass-produced car, the Holden in 1948. And over the space of around about 20 years, Australia had risen to the heyday to be around about 10th in the world scene in terms of vehicle manufacture. And at that time, around about 500,000 units each and every year coming out and being built in Australia. Take that back to 2004, and still around about 400,000 units, and then we started meeting a bit of a decline, obviously with foreign imports coming in and various other things happening economically, reduced very quickly down to 175,000 units by 2009. Things like the Bridgestone plant becoming the last tyre manufacturer in 2010, and then the well-documented closures and very sad closures of the Ford engine plant in Geelong, and then Holden and Toyota, South Australia, etc., around about 2017. So, quite a rapid rise, some success, and then unfortunately a bit of a decline. Where are we currently? The Australian newspaper, interestingly, developed a bit of a concept called Carmageddon, they called it, saying we're pretty close to a point where 90% of people live in a household with access to a motor vehicle. Now, that one might be interesting. We might have a think about that one for the future when Dickson comes along and talks about automated vehicles and whether vehicle ownership may be something of the past. The latest census came out in July 2019, and you can pick out some of the headline numbers there. Just coming around about to 20 million vehicles, 19.5 million registered vehicles. One of the stats that I picked up on there was that the light rigid sales going up around about 5.7 and 6% per year. And the average age of the car fleet within Australia currently stands at around 10.2 years old. That's actually risen. The last time I looked at that a couple of years ago, it was around about 9.6 years old. So there may be some factors there that we might want to think about. Obviously varies within the states, and also things like the presence of government departments, for example, in ACT, where the more rapid turnover of vehicles into the second-hand market. The most popular models, most certainly the 3 most popular models, are utility vehicles these days. The Toyota Hilux has been certainly over the last 4 years, but around about 3,700 units. And then the highest production car, if you like, is the Hyundai i30, only around about 2,300 vehicles a year. In terms of registrations, Toyota, 2.9 million vehicles registered, and they've been the leading registered vehicles for the last 14 years or so on the national scene. I think one of the things that may have come out and certainly need to be aware of is the utility vehicle, as we saw the first 3 leaders in the car sales, but their versatility very much so for the Aussie environment. The work vehicle very much so, but also robust enough to give us the recreational vehicle, and indeed sumptuous enough in many degrees with the dual cabs to become the family car as well. So to the ownership of one vehicle, which may get by. Lots of good in-vehicle safety features, not just a bone rattler and shaker going about the work. So that may well be one of the issues there, or certainly one of the development features of the Australian market over the years. So that's what I've got for you. Just a few stats there. I don't know if any of our panelists have got any thoughts on that one before we have a look at what's left and where we're going with the industry. Any comments, guys?
Looking at these utes, I was just going to say, Dickson and I were talking about this a few days ago, actually, and the fact that you mentioned safety, but in general terms, utes do, Dickson can probably explain more, escape some of the sort of safety regs that a lot of the other passenger vehicles do have to meet.
Yeah, no, that's right, because of the category that they're in. Under the commercial category, they can get away with being a lap belt in the center rear seats for a dual cab, so to speak. So yeah, safety is becoming a more, as you mentioned, Paul, where families are using the ute as a double cab for both Monday to Friday workhorse, and then on a weekend, a bit of a family cruiser.
Yeah, I think it'd be interesting to know some of the combined numbers. Whilst we had there each and every year, you know, 3,500. What's the total number? Perhaps should have given you a number, and one we might want to look at afterwards, and their sort of retention in the fleet, and whether people move on, how long they retain the utility vehicles, as you say, you know, in terms of that lag of getting the safety features out there. But certainly a lot more palatial than they once were. I think it'd be a good point, and quite a smooth ride, high ride that people like within Australia. You know, the vehicles and opportunities to have your bars on the front and whip aerials and radio systems and braking assist and able to tow as well. So there's sort of a bit of an ultimate all-rounder for the Aussie market, I think, in those. Dickson, what it's not all doom and gloom, I gather. So what's the situation with the current industry and certainly with things like electric vehicles and zero emissions and things like that? What have you got for us there?
No, thanks, Paul. I guess, as you mentioned, with the demise of the manufacturers in Australia since beginning of 2018, where all the Toyota, Holden, and Ford, the last three to close their doors. But also bear in mind that Ford, Holden, and Toyota still have their engineering development and design facilities here in Australia, which means that Australia is still one of those countries that is able to design and develop mass market vehicles to their parent companies. So we still have quite a bit of talent here in Australia that we retain, and some of those have led to what you call a startup market, startup companies of EVs and other type of vehicles in Australia. An interesting point as well is the emergence of electric and zero emissions vehicles. Most people know that the EV, like the Teslas, make up very small amount of new vehicles in Australia and also globally. But more and more we'll see this incline growth in this form of powered vehicle. Especially if there's incentives coming from the governments and manufacturers, like in the US and in Japan, where there's encouragement of taking up the EVs to reduce emissions, and by doing so, you get incentives, whether it be registration, insurance, parking, any different type, whether it comes from the government or manufacturers themselves. And in the next coming years, over the next 5 years, there are all these new models that's been noted in magazines and in the social medias, whether it be Volvo, the Mercedes-Benz, Mini, Porsches, Nissan Leaf, which just was released late last year, even Audi with the e-trons and what have you. So many manufacturers are joining the bandwagon of these electric and zero emissions vehicles. And why I call it zero emissions vehicle is in the bottom right corner of the FCV fuel cell vehicle, such as the Mirai, the Toyota Mirai, which was introduced in 2014. But it's commercially available in the US, in Japan from 2017. The range in terms of the kilometers is comparable to both EVs as well as hybrids, and also your combustion engine, and to fuel up and what have you is very comparable. So these are the new derivative of vehicles that we will see in the future. And like I said, the growth will just be increasing over the coming years.
Okay, thanks, Dickson.
Dickson, where he shows the evolution of sort of 20 years from that picture, Paul, that you showed from 1903 to when basically you had no cars on the road to when the road was completely full of cars. So I think that 20 years is not as long as we all maybe think.
Absolutely, a great point. While Rosie just picks up, are there any questions from the audience? Is there anything else in the panel on the stats we had there from the car industry, but also anything in the evolving on the electric vehicle scene and zero emissions?
I guess just to add to that point, that we were talking about traditional vehicles where it sits 5 passengers, or your vans where it sits 7. There's a lot of what we call newer design or shuttle vehicles, electric vehicles, where they're accommodating 9, 11, 12 type passengers, as we'll discuss further later on. So the design of the motor vehicle itself is changing as well.
Okay, Rosie, have we got any thoughts?
Yes, Karen has asked, is there a website that compares all the features of the electric hybrid vehicles? Would Dickson know one?
Well, there are many third-party websites on the internet, whether it be, like the different webpage like carpoint.com or carsales.com and all that stuff. They usually have comparable, what they call variants and what have you that you can compare to look at all the different electric vehicles, their features, safety features, even the powertrain, what's their range. Even if you go to other comparable sites in other countries, from that point to get a gist of some of the features, so to speak. But I'm sure those third parties website I mentioned in Australia would carry those information.
And a question from Onkar: are hydrogen cars still in planning considerations?
Yeah, no, definitely hydrogen vehicles. I know Toyota and Hyundai in Australia has been making a lot of gains and grounds with government and also stakeholders in terms of getting the infrastructure in place. I know in 2015 when we try and get 3 hydrogen vehicles, the Mirai fuel cell vehicle in Australia, after Hyundai had their engineering evaluation vehicle. There was a bit of promotion tour around Australia to showcase that technology. That technology is readily available in Europe and in US and of course in Japan in that regard, where there is infrastructure to support the fueling of those vehicles.
Thank you. And Matthew has a few comments, and we've also got a question from Ron that we'll ask when Alan has done his part. So Matthew's commented that Redbook is a pretty good site and most accurate numbers.
I agree with that.
Yeah.
And he says that Ford in Australia is responsible for Everest as well, and also made a comment about high performance off-road like the Ranger Raptor.
Yeah.
So, okay, so let's move on now, Paul.
Okay, so we'll catch up with any more questions. Just keep them coming, and Rosie will pick them up as you come on. Absolute great pleasure to hand on to Alan Hay now. Alan's going to take us through this section here. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. Over to you, Alan.
Hi. Look, great so far, guys. What I want to take us through, though, is where we've come from and what the motor vehicle actually means to Australians. And to help me do that, I'd like to introduce to you one of my advocate colleagues for the motoring enthusiast community. Tony O'Donnell is actually an official legend of the motoring enthusiast community, even though he's still alive. He is the president of the Australian Confederation of Motor Clubs and also a drag racer of old. And that doesn't mean to say he wears slingbacks and pearls. He is currently a director at the drag racing circuit out at Eastern Creek. And I'd like to welcome my good friend and compadre, Tony O'Donnell.
Good afternoon.
How are you, Tony?
Good.
Great to have you here.
Yeah, it's good to be here. It's been an interesting discussion, actually. One thing I do pick up on is that the electric vehicle is not a new thing. If you look back to things like the Detroit Electric, which was built in the first decade of the 20th century, 1903, 1904, around there have been electric vehicles and steam vehicles and all sorts of alternative fuels tried over the course of time. So the technology has been there to a greater or lesser degree over the years, and it's a matter of there might be more than one solution to all this down the track.
Yeah, that's right.
Absolutely.
Without a doubt, Tony. I'll tell you what, why don't we actually let people know what the Australian Confederation of Motor Clubs actually represents, and let's try and dispel some of the myths about who motoring enthusiasts are and what we actually do.
Yeah, the Australian Confederation of Motor Clubs was started because, as with so many things we do in life, I suppose, the motor enthusiast group is probably very hard to pin down as one particular demographic. It's actually quite tribal. So we have everybody from people who restore older cars, people who like to have fun with newer cars, people who have four-wheel drives, people who have hot rods and street machines and muscle cars and all sorts of things. The problem we had in dealing with authorities and dealing with regulation and all sorts of things, was that we all spoke as separate voices. So a few years ago now, we decided it would be a good idea if there was some organisation that allowed all of those people to get together and discuss their issues and pick some representatives who could actually talk with government and authorities about some of the issues we faced and some ideas we had to make things move forward.
I mean, Tony, we've spoken about this a great deal, but
A great deal.
A lot of listeners out there won't be aware of the fact that we do cover multiple disciplines. It is from your historic car side of things. It does cover everything from utes to four-wheel drives to people who like muscle cars and street machines to hot rodders. A meeting around one of our tables, it does represent every possible sector of society, doesn't it?
It does. And, you know, rich people, poor people, we like to be the sensible voice of all this. We have to acknowledge that there is the odd hoon. If you get a big enough group of people involved in an activity, you'll find the odd one who's probably not somebody you'd choose to spend much time with. But I think the public perception of us has not been as good as we would have liked, I suppose. When you go through all the different disciplines we represent there, I've probably had most of that stuff. I don't think I've ever owned a four-wheel drive, but I've certainly had hot rods and street machines and muscle cars and historic cars, and I've raced. I've mostly been a circuit racer, actually. I've used to race open wheelers, and I've done a little bit of drag racing and even tried speedway briefly. And I kind of figured that I can't be the only person that likes more than one thing.
No,
and, I think that's where we started.
I mean, why is it important we do what we do? What is it about Australians and their cars, mate? What is it? The case that the car has built Australian society, or has Australian society helped molded our use of the automobile? Which way around should it be, do you think?
It's kind of complementary, I suppose. I think if you look at Australia, more than most other places on the planet, it was opened up by the motor car in the first place, because of the distances we had to cover and the lack of population that some other countries had. Where you might argue that the US, for instance, was opened up mostly by the railroads. Here, and still to some extent, we have such distances and such a small population that you simply can't cover it with the sort of infrastructure that's required for railroads or even airports to some extent. You look at the moment, a hot topic is trying to get back and spend some time and some money in some of the areas that have been damaged by bushfires. Now, they're traditionally areas that were visited during your road trip holidays, but we all climbed into the car and went on our holidays over the course of years. That's what we did. So I think the car certainly opened up Australia. It allowed our suburbs to spread. You know, it's particularly relevant in Sydney, where Sydney is a vast expanse of a city, and it certainly grew much more quickly than you could grow railroads or even bus routes and things to service it. So everybody had to have cars. Looking at it the other way
that
around,
really sort of took off in the 1950s. I mean, the Second World War obviously brought engine manufacturing technology to Australia, which allowed us to really have our first real sort of Australian car. The Holden.
And to some extent there, that's where
it also brought a lot of prosperity.
Yeah. It's where Australia started to shape this type of cars that we have. So you'll find that Australian cars are a bit different. They were kind of a slightly larger and simpler, a bit more powerful than the stuff that was coming out of England and Europe. and a whole lot smaller than the stuff that was coming out of the US. Before World War II, we were heavily dependent on the English manufacturers for the sort of cars that we drove, along with some big American stuff. After the war, the first car that you could say was properly manufactured here. We certainly had cars manufactured right back to the turn of the century almost at that point, but mostly in small volumes.
Yeah,
but
they were kits, weren't they?
They were mostly made up of bits from other manufacturers. We had things like the Australian 6. Even Charles Kingsford Smith set up a car company at one point. Not nearly as successfully as some of his flying efforts. Yeah, we certainly had a manufacturing industry, but it grew exponentially straight after the war. Until 1948, the highest selling car in Australia was the Austin A40, which, if you wanted to cover big distances, might not have been the ideal contraption to do it in. So the Holden,
not very comfortable.
Well, not very comfortable. Let's say the Holden allowed you to climb into a car at point A with a reasonable chance of getting to point B if you were covering a big distance too, because it was a big, simple, lazier 6-cylinder car with a bit of room for passengers, so Mum and Dad could go to the shops with it, or you could go on holidays in it. Dad could probably maintain it in his driveway. So that, to that extent, Australia shaped the sort of cars that we got as well.
So in the 1950s, Tony, I mean, people had a lot more money. Australia was powering along. Our suburbs were being built. The average family could afford a car. I mean, what were they buying?
Well, up until the end of the 50s, by about 1959, 52%, I think, of the Australian market was Holdens. Before that, it was a mixture of things like Austins and Morrises and the odd Hillman, some American cars if you were wealthy enough. Fuel prices weren't a big deal.
They were being built in Australia.
Yeah.
Those American cars were being built in Australia.
Mostly being assembled in Australia. Yeah. In fact, I mean, I can remember you used to buy your local Holden dealer, for instance, would sell you a Holden or a Vauxhall for that matter, but they'll certainly sell you a Chevrolet or a Pontiac as well. But they were imported as kits, mostly from Canada, as a matter of fact, because Canada was another Commonwealth country, and it was easier to import them there. The taxation issues and things didn't affect them as much.
Well, Tony, look, we need to move on, but one of the points of this webinar is, well, did you know? Well, I'm sure a lot of people out there do not or are not aware that self-identified modelling enthusiasts count to about 700,000 across Australia. And we support an aftermarket worth $11 billion per annum and 30,000 jobs.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, and we spend a lot of money in regional communities, for instance. So we, apart from the fund we have and what we contribute in terms of preservation of heritage in the country, for instance, we are a strong economic influence. We spend a lot of money in this country. The aftermarket industry, which is really the motor industry we have left now, brings in good export dollars, but we certainly are supporting a good, strong industry and a lot of people. And apart from the motor enthusiasts themselves, man, we all have families who are all involved in this as well. So there's a big cultural benefit, I think, that comes from us, but certainly a measurable economic benefit.
Oh dear.
Hello, Paul. We're just having a little.
We've had a bit of difficulty with Alan, I think.
We'll just move on, I think.
I'll pick up a couple of
community. We've got
Oh dear. I have a bit of a
certainly one of Alan's points were going to be that the voice and certainly the strength of the motoring industry, motoring interest, sorry, certainly that, you know, ignore the peril. I mean, certainly need to be integrated, not exterminated, and can have a difference certainly within our growth areas in transport and what the network's going to look like in the future. But also one of the points that Alan, I think, was going to make was that, you know, people may have 3, 4, 5 vehicles and then the day car as well, which does take into interest some of the safety and abort with respect to safety features that may be on vehicles, and with interest in the ANCAP ratings and various things like that. So I think that we'll try and sort out Alan's link. We'll push on. We'll go on to Dixon. Dixon's going to talk to us about some of these safety features on the vehicles and where they're going. So we'll pass on to you, Dixon, if we can.
Sure, Paul. I guess to begin with, ANCAP, or the Australasia's new car assessment program. Basically, since the late 1990s, early 2000s, there's been a stronger push for safer vehicles. And basically what ANCAP does is to try and compare apples with apples. So based on certain criteria, based on certain tests, program and regime as shown there, vehicles are being assessed in terms of their crashworthiness and all the other features, whether it be the adult occupant protection, child occupant protection, the vulnerable road users protection, and also the safety assist technology that we'll talk on later. Since 2011, there's been a strong push, even stronger push and uptake from the fleet to try and ensure that people are getting into safest possible car. And from 2018, the ANCAP protocols or the test requirement has been aligned with Euro ANCAP. Moving on, in terms of the Australian design rules and in terms of importation, as being alerted to earlier on, to have the vehicle imported into Australia, it must meet the Australian design rules, which means that there's certain standards, or minimal standards for safety, emissions, and anti-theft. And since 2000, where Australia is a signatory of 1958 agreement, which means it is a signatory of the UNECE, which is a international standard. What that means is that a lot of the regulations are being aligned and harmonized with the United Nations ECE regulations. And what this means is that it's easier for manufacturers to just test once, whether it be in Europe or what have you, and then get their approval, and therefore they get that little plate, so to speak, that says that the vehicle meets all the ADRs and all the requirements, therefore it can be imported and be certified and be driven in Australia. Moving right ahead, in terms of some of the safety features that we touched on with all these new introductory vehicles, one of those that most people would know about is the autonomous or auto emergency braking. What it does is, it sends a signal to you that you should brake if it's imminent, that you're going to have a crash or what have you. It sends a prompt, and then should you miss that or be distracted, the car will try and stop itself. There's other features that's being fitted to modern day cars, especially from 2018, with the requirement of the Euro NCAP to achieve 5 stars, such as blind side monitoring, where it would give you your blind spot detection, where there's vehicles on your blind spot. Moving on to the other steering assist technology, where the vehicle can steer itself within the lane. Adaptive cruise control, where you keep this distance rather than your just conventional cruise control at 100 kilometers, 80 kilometers. You don't have to keep stepping on the brakes manually. The vehicle will slow down should the front vehicle be reducing its speed. The following vehicle will reduce the speed automatically as well. Lane departure, again, is just trying to keep the vehicle in lane such that you will not verge onto the oncoming traffic or the side lane, so to speak, and avoid any side impacts. One of the newer technology, the rear cross traffic alert, as you're reversing out of the car parks and what have you, it sends a detection that there's a car approaching, and therefore the vehicle stops itself before even you can see it on the camera. So all this technology, there's a lot of acronyms being thrown and what have you. So there's that need of what you call education, so to speak. And what does this mean for driver education? One of a good example is that my mother-in-law, just recently purchased a new vehicle and had all this new technology, AEB, ACC and all that stuff. The first thing she wanted to do was turn everything off. And when I got into the car, I was asking, why? And he goes, oh, I don't like the vehicle driving for me. And on the other end, on the contrast, my sister-in-law was getting her learners. So she was driving and she got into one of my vehicle. And she was driving, which was all fine as a learner. And then when she tried and reverse park, she was trying to find a button. And she asked me, where's your reverse parking button? I said, what do you mean? It's just, it's already automatic in terms of your gearing. And she goes, no, I need that button to press and the car drive itself to park. And I was saying to her, I said, can't you park? She goes, I've never done it. So I was like, wow, as we progress with new technology, what does this mean for our driver education is an important question.
Mm. All right.
A field which is constantly going to go more and more. So, Tia, you have some thoughts?
Well, I just discussing this whole safety and then also the vintage vehicles, both which have a very dear place in my heart. It just sort of highlights in my mind some crashes that I've investigated where you've got a vintage vehicle in a crash with a sort of what I'll call a modern vehicle. And in some of these cases, you've got a driver that's being charged with some sort of very serious crime on the road. And it's interesting to me to hear, I guess, from Alan when we get him back, his view and Tony's view on whether or not, if you're driving around in a vintage vehicle, do you have any onus, to account for the fact that you aren't having any of these modern safety systems. You don't have airbags, you don't have modern seat belts, you don't have the modern padding that we see on the interior, all these features that we now mandate. And so if someone's, I guess, being charged with a crime because you've been injured, it's interesting to know, I guess, what their point of view would be.
That's awesome, Tia. Let's get Alan at the end to address that, and we'll move on with your section. Sorry, Paul.
Okay, so we'll get Alan and Tony back in with some on that. But I think just wanted to sum up this section by just saying, look, in terms of the overall safer vehicles effort of the safe system, there's a photograph indeed there of an incident which occurred where eminently possible that the people involved in that wouldn't have walked away and wouldn't have survived the incident, even going back 3, 4, 5 years or so. So I think we can stress that we're putting a lot of store in reaching or going towards zero from the vehicles. And I think one of the good things is that things are becoming more and more available. As I mentioned, the Kona that I drive is a bit of a compromise for me in terms of budget and safety features that I can get. It always used to be, on some of the more modern vehicles, the Lexus and Mercedes, etc. Now very much affordable in the city car and the more sort of evolutionary efforts on the safety system side of things, becoming more and more available and cheaper. So I think it's a really good thing. And but whether we push all store on that, I think there's a number of other things that we need to work on, not least our safe road infrastructure and various things that we're all sort of keyed into. We'll have some more questions from the audience in a second, but I'll with pleasure hand over to Tia. And Tia, talk to us a bit about the learning potential that some of the things now give us.
Sure. So investigating crashes is quite interesting, and as with all technology, it is evolving rapidly at the moment. So currently we're starting to see some more ways, and we'll just push through that, Paul. That's me testing a Ferrari out at Calder. Ferrari was involved in a crash, and I was very excited to see how quickly this vehicle would stop, and found out it didn't stop any quicker than any other car I've ever tested. So although it accelerates rapidly, it does not necessarily brake. So telematics. This is something, obviously, a new emerging technology. It's not that new, actually, but it's been out for several years now. Mostly installed in the heavy vehicle industry, but now we're starting to see it pop up in lots of different fleets. So, normal passenger cars might have this. Primarily looking at driver analytics, so things like is there harsh braking? Is there overspeed primarily? So you can see down there at the bottom, that's a recording of some overspeed events. So the driver is exceeding the speed limit. It reports that back to his place of business. And in some companies, they have a 3 in, you're out. So three overspeeds. Obviously, this driver doesn't have that because he's got 4 there. But 3 and you're out, and then you aren't going to have to find a new job. Also looking at things like fuel consumption and what safer routes are, and whether or not the engine's running properly, maintenance and all that, and hopefully having some reductions in crashes. next, there we go. All right, so the infamous black box. The black box, originally an Australian invention, came as a flight data recorder. Originally, it may have been black at some stage, but currently the box is a very bright orange color in an aircraft so that it's easy to locate. And in most vehicles, it's a silver color, and it's located sort of right in the middle of the vehicle, very difficult to get to, and it's sort of the size of 2 iPhones. This records an amazing amount of information, and it really is an ongoing recorder of the computer. So you can see in the bottom left, that is me downloading the data out of a vehicle. It's very easy. I plug into the diagnostic port. I basically hit run within 50 seconds or less. I've got every single thing I could want to know about the crash. So 5 seconds before the crash, I know the speed of the vehicle, 4 seconds, 3 seconds, 2 seconds, 1 second impact. I can tell whether or not the restraints are worn. I can tell whether or not the headlights are on. I can tell whether or not the brake lights are on. So there's a lot of information. And essentially, if you're doing something wrong in a crash, it's very evident. And if you're not, so if you're not doing anything wrong, then it will also be very apparent. This is something that is a little bit controversial and maybe a little bit alarming to some of the listeners. This is sort of a new age of what we call vehicle digital forensics. And this is essentially what we have now is a point in 2020 where vehicles are no longer mechanical devices. We're now running on a piece of software. So if you think about that, all the information that's stored in your infotainment unit, so things like your mobile phone data, where you've been, you can see on the bottom left there, that has been extracted from a vehicle using basically a piece of software, and we get out, we know where the vehicle's been. I can look up what phone numbers have been called. I can look up where it's been, how long it's been there. So it is a bit alarming, in fact, but something you need to be aware of.
And even I gather your infotainment system down to maybe even what you were listening to at the time something may have happened, or
well, Paul, at this point we're talking about ones and zeros, literally. I mean, you can think about the amount of data that goes through your vehicle, and yes, the reality is there is no end to how much data that we can get out. This is only going to evolve further. And we see a point where eventually, and we know this, vehicle to infrastructure is going, your vehicle is eventually, and not far from now, going to be talking to the infrastructure. So you're not going to probably be able to speed very soon because your vehicle is going to be talking to the road, and the road will know what the speed limit is, and your vehicle will know what the speed limit is. Yes, so all these things are here. We had a question about, don't you need a warrant to get this data out of the vehicle? I think rather than thinking about it as the car, it really is more like your cell phone or your mobile phone. You can think about if you're in a crash, certainly one of the things that they would do would be to grab your phone, download the data, work out whether or not you're on the phone. The vehicle is really becoming more like that. So that's something.
Excellent. So just a snapshot, but as we'll talk about a little bit later, Tia's got some content coming up, which I'm sure people will be very interested in hearing some more of the thoughts on how we're going to get to 2050 and some of the things that are going to come in there. We'll come back to that a little bit later. Rosie, any questions coming in? Conscious of the fact we've had a bit of information sort of overload to people out there, but any questions come through that we need to consider as the panel?
Yes, we have a great question for Tia from John. Can the black box be tampered, or is it considered as illegal evidence?
Well, the answer is yes. If you want to tamper with it, you probably could, and there are ways that happens. Let me just say it's not a great idea to do that. Then you might be in a whole lot more trouble than you would have been in otherwise. But yes, the answer is yes, it can. I'm not going to go into how because I'm a safety advocate. I'd rather you not be doing that. But the answer is yes, it can be tampered with.
I guess just to add to that as well, in terms of the data, the so-called the black box, you need the sort of tools and what have you to actually download those data from the OEM perspective as well. So it is not a straightforward hacking type tools where you just hack the whole thing out and try and get the information. Am I right, Tia?
Well, they can be done by the OEM, but there is an aftermarket tool made by Bosch, and that's the one that I use. It covers a large majority of vehicles now. Bosch has worked really hard with the insurance industry in America to get access to a lot of these vehicles. there are plenty of vehicles that aren't on that list, but it's pretty straightforward.
Can we
Awesome.
go back? Is Alan Tony there? Can we go back to the question that Tia had about, I think it was, do you drive any differently? I think it was in terms of the knowing you don't have the safety features in the vehicle. I think I would be really interested in their views on that one.
Yes. Sorry, can you hear me? I'm sorry, I think we had a communication problem earlier.
Loud
we
and
can hear
clear.
you.
Yeah.
Oh, great stuff. So, Tony, look, from my perspective, what we tend to do with our vehicles is, because we maintain them to a very high standard, and we work on them quite a lot, we tend to know all of their little idiosyncrasies, and we drive with those in mind. We've also fought quite hard to ensure that where upgrades are historically sympathetic, so moving from, say, drum brakes to disc brakes, we encourage that, and we don't actually believe that that should be something withheld. But Tony, what would you add?
Well, I think it's fair to say that the safest thing is not to crash the car at all, which is pretty much where we come from as enthusiasts. Having come from the insurance industry for, spent 20 odd years in the insurance industry, and specialising in insuring classic and modified cars, the insurance experience with them was much better than we found with the modern cars, simply because of the way people use them. Not just the fact that they're not as exposed as often on the road, but they're driven more carefully by people who tend to know how to drive them. One of the hazards we need to look for with all this technology is that it will be dumbing down the driving experience. I mean, we all drive a modern car. We have our dream cars. I was looking through what everybody was driving as their daily driver there before, and I think the majority of our road use would be in modern cars. But quite simply, the biggest advance ever made in terms of safety, before we worried about airbags and all sorts of other stuff, really a reasonable structure and proper seat belts and things. The compulsory seatbelt use in Australia was probably the biggest quantum leap we had in terms of road safety.
What was that, 1969, wasn't it?
Yeah, about 1970. So
71 was all seats, I think.
Yeah. Interestingly enough, from 1965, seatbelt mounting points had to be installed in cars, but the seatbelts didn't have to go with them. But yeah, certainly from 1970 in Victoria, compulsory seatbelt wearing was introduced. It was the first place in the world to introduce it, and I think that's been the largest quantum leap. As a matter of fact, a member of one of the car clubs that I'm in used to be a plastic surgeon, and the observation he made is his business fell in half as soon as compulsory seatbelt wearing was introduced, because people weren't travelling through windscreens and things when the car stopped. So
it's good.
So most of our cars would have some safety built into them. No point. They're not all modern S-Class Mercedes-Benzes and things. If you want to carry that argument forward, they should all be big, solid things like S-Class Mercedes-Benzes and things. I mean, and that's simply not logical.
Okay, Rosie, if we got one final question, perhaps before we take on to the final section. We've got about 5 minutes to go or so.
Yeah, I think we'll move on to the final section, and all of that discussion has answered some of the questions that were sitting there, so that's awesome. So let's move on.
Okay, and we'll give the panel final wrap up on this. So I think it's just worth having a look at some of the current and future challenges, and something that we would be remiss if we didn't mention today was, from our safety backgrounds, is having a look at the annual road toll for the end of December. The figures came out earlier this week. 1188 is that key figure for the past 12 months. Might get adjusted slightly. That's available through the obituary bulletins that come out every month. Australia standing around at 4.7 fatalities on the roads per 100,000 population, which around about our sort of plateauing at the moment again. We fell below 5 about 5 or 6 years ago now, but some of the best performing countries are around about that 2.6, 2.8 mark. So we're under no illusions, we've got a fair bit to do. Those with the eagle-eyed will have had a look down the bottom there and looked at the various differences within the states. Certainly Queensland and South Australia, a bit of variance, but nationally so it is a bit of an increase, and we're certainly working through the National Road Safety Strategy to come up with some other things. A little bit of self-indulgence here, I guess. Licensing is one thing that interests me. Not a huge sort of professional field, but as in my family, I have a green pea plater and one just about to go on yellow peas. Are really galvanizes me every single time you see the graph on the right-hand side there, the increase in risk from when people move from their L's through to their P plates and driving on their own, and hopefully something, be much more improvements in the system or entry to the system as we go along. And I think the key message, making that license as much a privilege and not a right, just as we did with, making drink driving and things like that socially irresponsible. Tia, I think amplifying one of Tony's points there, but we're still seeing the big 4 and the big 3 things or giving us crashes.
Yep. Yeah, Tony's point about seatbelts is spot on. That is 100% everyone listening, the thing that you can do to save yourself in a crash. And alarmingly, last year, a huge percentage of crashes, fatal crashes, were of unrestrained occupants, people still not putting their seatbelt on. Most of them are males. These are not young males. These are what I'll call professional males, to be kind to everyone. Professional age and older males. So put your seatbelt on, please, when you get in the car. Yep. Also, we know that fatigue and drunk driving are still an issue. So still here.
Still got to, we come up with those solutions, and speed and incremental speeding or low-level speeding is one of the big things we're looking at solving at the moment. But also, local people dying on local roads, one of the big campaigns which have been going. So we really need to keep working on that. Vehicles are going to be, hopefully, some of the big part of the solution. Hopefully by 2030, we're going to be detecting alcohol and drugs in the drivers. Tia, you got some thoughts on this one, I think?
Yep, I think Australia's reached a point as a society where it is not okay to drink and drive. We know this. It is not okay. It is unacceptable. And that's really what we're hoping starts to become the case with speeding. I mean, it's funny, people wouldn't drink and drive with one drink, but yet they'll go 5 kilometers per hour over the limit, and that's okay. It's actually not okay, and there's just as much of a influence on crash risk and fatal crash risk. So we know that some of the systems that we're going to start seeing in vehicles are inbuilt detection of alcohol and drugs. And the next one is fatigue. So fatigue is a massive problem. Again, very difficult to measure. Currently, a lot of trials ongoing trying to work out the physiological responses. And the ultimate goal would be, as you see here, a roadside test where you're not being tested for alcohol and drugs. You're actually being tested to see if you're tired and driving tired.
Okay, automated vehicles, Dickson. I mean, we're moving towards that stage by stage. I don't know, some personal thoughts. When are we going to get to full automation? Whereabouts are we now? Just, I know it's a tough one for you to cover very quickly, but just a few thoughts here.
Yeah, no, I guess this is where, better education, better understanding of all the different terminology and the technology itself, which is this infographics, there was collaboration between ARRB and the Federal Chambers of Automotive Industry, so that the auto industry to better educate the public in terms of where we're heading. We have got a 10-year car park, as I mentioned earlier on, and we only have about 1 million sales per year of new car vehicles. So we have a long transitional period, so to speak, before we have what we call a highly automated industry of new vehicles on the roads.
We talk a lot about movement and place, and it may be choosing the vehicle for the journey with the terms of the automation and longer distances and shorter distances, I guess. And I know it's something Alan mentioned when we were putting this together about choosing the vehicle for the journey. I don't know, Alan, if you got a point on that.
Yeah, look, we are moving to a mobility as a service future. There's no doubt about that, and I think you'll find that most motoring enthusiasts do have a daily driver that Tia, you'll be glad to hear, does actually contain many of the safety features that we've been talking about. So the actual type of vehicle you will choose, if you're going down to the shops, you may choose to use your classic car. If you want to go away with the family, you'll choose your 4-wheel drive. It's one of those things, and if I have some final words, it would be, look, we have a very bright future that has to be written specifically for Australia. Australians and their modes of transport are very closely linked, like no other country in the world. And Tony, I'd like to thank you, and I'd also like to applaud ARRB on their birthday. It's taken this holistic view towards problem solving that ARRB does so well, and having the likes of myself and Tony on board to discuss the community's attitudes towards motoring that will help actually take the community with us on this journey. Tony, thank you once again. Do you have a final word, Tony?
Yeah, I think we just need to make sure that all of this fits together. I think as an enthusiast community, we're certainly not anti-autonomous vehicles, certainly not anti-electric vehicles, but it comes back to that point where you're saying you pick the car for the journey. So I think quite often, if we want to travel locally, electric cars and things probably have their place at the moment. Although most of my local travel is done with a good pair of walking shoes, to be honest. And my daily drive car is a BMW M4. So it's not one that I take to the shops all the time. So I think there are all sorts of solutions to this. The way we design our communities, the way we design our roads and make them fit in with trains and light rail and buses and all sorts of things, and cycling tracks. It's going to be part of a whole big picture, I think.
Multidisciplinary. Tony, thank you very much. Thanks for being part of this today. It's been great talking to you as usual.
Indeed, Tony, and I think you could have a very bright future at ARRB with your thoughts there on integrated transport and certainly keeping with a number of things there. So, indeed, my thanks. If I could just sort of very, very, very quickly sum it up, I know we've run out of time, and one of the things we will do, Rosemary will pass on the questions which are still there for people, and if you think about them after the event and want to type them in, we'll provide a response and some thoughts on that. We'll go through those at the end and provide you a reply via email. Rosie knows that we're very fastidious at that, where our email, our webinars, and we do go back. But there is something unique about Australia and travelling and driving from the road trip that many of us would have done during the festive season to the family, from getting to A to B in the metropolitan area or the CBD to work. And I think we've all come through that. We all enjoy our driving, we all love our driving, but and we certainly got that commitment to ourselves and our other people and our families to keeping it as safe as we possibly can. One of the things we're looking to do is to get to zero, looking towards that for around about 2050. And if I can just advise people that Tia is going to be having a look at that, a webinar coming up. So please keep a lookout for that one, register in the way that you did. Promises to be a really good look. Tia really polishes the crystal ball there and puts some numbers against things as they're going to be emerging, and some ideas in terms of timelines as well. So I can really encourage you to have a look at that. That'll be coming up very, very shortly. Any questions, we said Rosemary will be there, or you'll get a message come through with a survey at the end there where you can also put in some thoughts and further ones. And I say we will get back to you on those, and you'll get an email with also a recording of the webinar from today. So thank you to the panel members. Rosemary, thank you very much for moderating. I'll hand over to you to close things down and to shut up the shop, so to speak. But thanks everyone again for tuning in. We hope we've enjoyed it. Enjoy the long weekend coming up, and I guess the final word is drive safely on that if you're going on a road trip.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you for pulling all these experts together and designing the program. And if our audience could stay on the line and fill out our survey, we'd be so grateful. See you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.